And welcome to this introductory video on the Workplace Learning and Support Framework. My name is Dr. Karina Dancer, and in this session, I hope to go through with you 3 of the next steps in the implementation process. So now that you're familiar with the framework and you've formed your team, the next step is to complete the organizational self-assessment tool, and we'll work through what that looks like. We then ask you to review 1 or 2 principles in detail before you develop your action plan. So we'll be going through each of those to hopefully guide you through that process. So I hope you find this information helpful. Now that you've become familiar with the 5 principles of the framework and you've formed your team, the next step is to complete the organizational self-assessment tool and then review the principles in detail and develop an action plan. So we'll be going through each one of those steps. The Organizational Self-Assessment Tool essentially is a document that outlines some of the key criteria within each of the principles. So at the start, you've got who this is completed by and the date which it is completed. We then have some prompt questions for each one of the principles. So for access in the first principle, do allied health workers have access to workplace learning and support regardless of their level or workplace? And is this inclusive of training, coaching, mentoring, and peer support? So that is meant to be a prompt question for the team to discuss, and then you can provide the rating, and we've just used smiley faces for the rating. It really is up to each organization to determine how they want to implement that rating scale. Essentially, it is just so that we can start to prioritize what areas are important to focus on. So actually the rating may be important, but it's the notes that people make underneath that rating which is probably going to be more valuable. So once you've worked through each of the 5 principles and those prompt questions, you might also want to refer back to the successful outcomes as well if you need some more detail or more advice. Finally, you will then generate an overall impression and priority principles to focus on. So once you've got an overview of each one of those areas, then it is up to the team to then decide what is the priority, what should we work on first, and that is where you would record that information. So we do suggest and recommend that you only focus on 1 principle at a time, at most 2. We feel that if you are focusing on all 5 at once, it could become quite overwhelming for yourself and the team and maybe less successful. But you can always work on other principles a bit later on. So some additional tips when using the organizational self-assessment tool. So it can be used to plan for a single area, such as a particular discipline or program, or you could use it to be applied across multiple areas. And in the case of multiple areas, it's recommended to base the overall rating on the area where the activity is performed the least effectively. By completing the self-assessment, you can then identify and prioritize areas of focus that align with specific principles. So that is the intention, is to actually help you to prioritize what to focus on. So don't get too caught up in the rating. It's more about trying to identify what is the priority. As I mentioned, it's advisable to concentrate on 1 or possibly 2 principles at a time, but you might decide that to focus on 1 and then schedule when you might move on to another principle. Another option is to concentrate at an individual level using the Workplace Learning and Support Individual Reflective Assessment tool, and this can be found in Appendix B. We understand that different workplaces have different levels of staffing and different interests in this, so it might be that both the organizational self-assessment and the individual one could be helpful for you to really prioritize where it is that you would like to focus. Once you have an idea of where the priority areas are from completing the organisational self-assessment tool, the next step is to actually review one or two principles in detail. So that's what we'll talk through next. So how to actually review these principles in detail. So in the guide, each principle is explained through statements about what the allied health workers will do and what the organisation will do. So each statement is further elaborated in a how it looks section. Suggestions are then provided on how this could be monitored. So in addition, each principle is mapped to one or more of the 8 successful outcomes of workplace learning and support. And Appendix A also provides some examples that show progress towards these outcomes. So throughout this process, the team may fine-tune their areas of focus by considering specific element statements or indicators. So on average, the review of each principle should take between half to 1 hour. Taking Principle 1 as an example here, so in the guide you will have the Principle 1 access, workplace learning and support are available to every allied health worker. So that's the description of the principle. You then have how this looks for allied health workers, and then you also have how this looks for organisations. So these are all color-coded. Then you have the principal statements. So 1.1 here is allied health workers are dedicated to finding and taking part in ongoing learning and support to improve their skills and knowledge. And how this looks is that allied health workers recognize learning and support opportunities and share them with others, that they value learning in both planned and unexpected situations. They take responsibility for accessing and using available resources for learning and support, and if applicable, they demonstrate the benefits of learning to gain support from their employer. So each one of these statements, we have a second statement, so 1.2, is that people who provide learning and support ensure that the resources that they provide are appropriate, helpful, and easily accessible. And again, we have some statements about how this looks for allied health workers. So each one of these has a statement for the worker themselves and then people who are actually providing that support. So this could be supervisors, mentors, line managers, anybody who has that responsibility for providing the support. We also have a section for organisations. So section 1.3 here is that the organisations makes it easy for everyone to find and use resources they need for workplace learning and support. And again, there's some statements about how this looks for organisations. So finally, on the next page here, we have some examples of how this could be monitored. So for example, we might see that the document personal development plans during annual appraisals. So these are giving you some ideas about what things could you actually monitor to ensure that everybody does have access to workplace learning and support. And some of these examples will relate to what the individual employee would be doing, and some of them might relate to the organization's systems as well. So there is a range of ideas, and we would suggest that you pick something that you feel is doable and that will give you the information that you feel will demonstrate you have made some progress or you are meeting this particular principle. I just wanted to share that each of the principles follows exactly the same format. So this is Principle 2, is the learning culture. It has an explanation of what that is. You then have the blue section, which is how this looks for allied health workers, with the 2.1 directed to the allied health worker themselves. 2.2 is really directed towards people who are in a support role or providing some of that supervision or mentoring support. The purple section is around how this looks for organisations, and then you also have how this could be monitored and some examples. Now you might see that there are some overlaps in how this could be monitored between principals as well. So you might be able to monitor more than one thing by doing a certain monitoring activity. So again, this is just showing that Principle 3 follows the same format. I just want to highlight a couple of things in the how this could be monitored, some of the examples. So for example, we have in here review organizational policies and procedures. So this might be a really helpful way of including some of the workplace learning and support ideas. Do they actually feature in handbooks for new staff? Are they a feature in maybe some of the HR policies that people are going to access and have opportunities to support their own well-being in the organization? So there is also looking at tracking the number of people that might be accessing some of the resources that are available. And there's also something in there about feedback opportunities. So is there legitimate feedback opportunities for the allied health workers to actually provide suggestions or to provide feedback on maybe the quality of some of the resources and some of the opportunities that they have made available to them? So Principle 4 around quality, again, you are looking at how this looks for allied health workers and for organisations, and then how it could be monitored. One of the things that we find very important within this framework is that dual responsibility between individuals but also the organisations. So we really do see this as a collaborative effort between both parties in order to ensure that as the workplace learning and support offer is meeting the needs and is also of sufficient quality. The final principle, Principle 5, is continuous improvement. And again, this follows the same format and has some examples of how this could be monitored. We do understand that workplace learning and support is going to need to change and evolve as organisations change, as society changes, as we have new evidence about our practices as well. So this is something that is going to be really important, even for very well established institutions. The idea of continuous improvement and change is really vital so that we can keep pace with wider society changes and make sure that our workforce is doing and meeting the needs of the population. Once the team has reviewed the principles in detail and particularly focused in on the ones that are priority for their organisation, the next step is to develop that action plan. So some ideas about developing an action plan. So as you review the priority principle with your team, there might be specific element statements, some of the indicators or the outcomes of success that help you to consider what actions are needed and doable in your organisation. So you might wish to think about what improvements could be achieved in the short term and what might require a bit more long-term planning. The action plan should detail specific actions and also assign responsibility to individuals or teams for completing those actions and establish recommended timeframes for their completion. Additionally, the action plan could incorporate a schedule for conducting the next organisational self-assessment, which could be scheduled at intervals ranging from 1 to 3 years, depending on the number of identified areas for development. We also think that maybe this action plan could provide a starting point or a jumping off point for quality improvement projects that you might wish to develop within your organisation. So this could also provide some justification for some of that ongoing work that's already happening. We've provided a very straightforward template for the Workplace Learning and Support Organisational Action Plan tool. This is something that you might choose to use, or you might have a form that is already in existence in your organisation that also does something similar. So essentially we have the actions and associated principles. We also are suggesting a priority, whether that's high or low, who it's assigned to, so the person and department, and a due date. There's also space in there for you to outline some outcomes of success and progress notes. So if you would like to review these at particular intervals, you can maybe update some of those progress notes and monitor that any achievements that have been made. So you've got a couple of lines there to do this. So it might be that each of the principles has a couple of, well, the principle that you're working on has maybe a couple of actions associated with it. The next steps, reviewing the full framework so that you have a good understanding is always a good thing just to recap, because it might be at this point that you want to go back to the appendices and have a look at some of the resources that are available, some of the templates, some of the ideas about how people have made progress in other areas, in other countries as well. So have a look at the framework in full. We suggest that you meet with your team and complete these steps 3, 4, and 5, and then finally move on to the final step, is step 6, which is celebrate success, and we'll share more about that in the next video.